Hello, good morning, all. Deb Myhoff with Communitas, the facilitator for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Rulemaking Technical Advisory Committee for Needed Housing and Production. Good morning. This is our 14th meeting, and we're excited you all are here digging into the third version of the rules. So Madi, if you haven't already, could you pull up the slide deck, please, and we'll get the meeting framed up and get digging in. Great, thank you. Just a reminder too, if you haven't already, to make sure you have your name and affiliation in your Zoom box so that folks tuning in can see who is on this call. And next slide, Madi, or the agenda slide. Great, thank you. So this morning we'll do the racial equity framing as always and encourage everyone to keep those elements in mind as we get into the specific discussion of the rules and thinking about options for refinements rules, really keeping that perspective and ability to bring this program more toward racial equity as we move forward. Their staff will provide an overview of some of the changes that are in this third iteration since the last time we met that you all have. And we'll take, as always, a little bit of time just to get some clarifications from you on the rules before we go into discussion. We have 3 items for discussion. We've added a third item that wasn't on the prior agenda, so we've amended the agenda, but we have plenty of time. So engagement and action flexibility were in your agenda. And then also we want to talk about the housing production strategy sort of action requirements, sort of how those actions are developed and written down in that section of rules, because we haven't touched on that section of rule much, maybe if at all. We just want to get your feedback on that and make sure that's moving in the right direction. And as time allows, we'll pick up other topics and issues or concerns you have. And a reminder that next week we'll be talking specifically about the contextualized housing need section of the rules. So we're asking you for just a little patience on digging into that until next week. And then we'll wrap up and get out of here by 12 o'clock. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to, I think, Madi. Great. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have covered the meeting objectives, which I think I probably just summarized. So we're here to review and build a shared understanding of the key changes between the second and third iteration of rules around especially the contextualized housing need and the housing production strategy, which we'll focus on today. Identify and discuss potential improvements to the third draft, focusing on those 3 sections I just mentioned, and then collecting your feedback, of course, and ideas for refinements in the next draft. So now I'm going to hand it over to Madi to frame us up.
Thank you, Deb, and good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone. Thank you for participating and joining today. For the record, my name is Madi Valencia Aguilar. I use she, they pronouns and a housing planner with the department. First, I do want to kick off this presentation by offering an appreciation to this TAC. We've been in the thick of it, you all. We've been meeting since March, and we are at the third iteration of draft rules, which is only possible with the collective kind of expertise and commitment from you all. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We're not done there yet, and today and next week's meeting is additional opportunities for us to continue to kind of dig in collectively in our tax. So still opportunities to kind of discuss refinements. So on this slide here, I do want to kick us off by quickly touching on just upcoming milestones. because we are far in the process and we're nearing the kind of first phase of the to get to the adoption of the rules that we've been tasked with. So a moment to kind of outline what's a look ahead is critical, I think. So today we're in our NAPTEC meeting. And next week we have another NAPTAC meeting scheduled on the 23rd. And as Deb noted, that one's gonna this week we're doing half of the rules related to the HPS and this and then the next week we're doing the remaining pieces that particularly focus on the contextualized housing need. These are today and next week are opportunities for you all to offer feedback in the meeting. Of course, feedback is always welcome throughout the entire rulemaking process, but next week potentially might be our last time together as part of this rulemaking space. So keep that in mind. Um, Next week on the 25th or Friday, we do have our public hearing with the LCDC scheduled. And so this is a moment for LCDC to hear public comment during the meeting. And some of you all have already signed up, so feel free to sign up if you would like to offer that before the LCDC. Then November 6th, we have our final meeting of the Rules Advisory Committee related to our work and the hot tack work. So related to the draft rules. That's their kind of last opportunity in a meeting to offer their feedback. On the 20th and a moment of next week on Friday with the public hearing, that's the initiation of a formal public hearing at LCDC, and that public hearing runs through November 14th. At midnight, we close that public hearing period. And then the first week of December, the 5th or 6th, we're still kind of working through the dates, but that's forthcoming. LC will have a meeting with LCDC, and that's going to be our hearing for the adoption of the draft rules related to the HOTAC and the NAPTAC scope. Some of you all are on the rack, so you'll this note about a 10th meeting is relevant. We've added that to our schedule, and we're shifting focus. And that rack meeting will focus specifically on the third technical advisory committee, which has been working through the rulemaking process, but will now be more centered in the work as they're kind of working towards their rule adoption deadline, which is the end of 2025. Our rules here are effective January 1st, 2025. And a note for you all to keep in mind is that's the first phase of the rules related to the ONA process. And per our calendar right now, the adopted HC and HPS schedule that LCDC adopted last year or earlier this year in January, the rules for the ONA really don't become effective or really don't become implemented just yet until 2028, with the first deadlines of the HPS being in that year. So with that, I think I'm going to move us along to our racial equity for decision making framework. You all have seen this slide before. This is we've been spotlighting and taking a moment to kind of ground us in racial equity and using this tool to remind us of the various components that are relevant to keep in the back of our mind, to bring forward in discussion. And we're not spotlighting anything today specifically. We're at this stage in the rulemaking process where all of these components that you see outlined in the slide are relevant. So my note to you all is just encouraging you all to lean into these various components of the racial equity framework, bring them forward in our discussion. Feel free to highlight anything that's coming up for you. And we're here to ensure that we're centering this particular work in our discussion. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move us to an overview of the third iteration of rules. Before doing that, some of you have heard me already offer this presentation because you sit on the rack, but bear with me. Maybe it might be great to hear me say it again, but for those others who aren't on the rack, I just want to take a moment to ground us in our what we've been doing to integrate the ONA policy into Goal 10. So this graphic you've seen before, this is our visual depiction of the um, planning process as outlined under Goal 10. Um, this is the planning work that cities do to meet their meet their needs of their community members. And really, this process boils down to three major items. They those being determining housing need through the contextualized housing need analysis, responding to those needs that are identified in that process of the contextualized housing need through meaningful and responsive actions included in a city's action plan, or what we call the housing production strategy. And then, of course, continuous tracking and monitoring on progress made on the actions that a city outlines in their HPS. Um, Through the ONA policy, you all have been working to revamp this process with the charge of better integrating affirmatively furthering fair housing and the needed housing translation of characteristics, types, and locations into this general process. And we've gone a long way. I'm going to quickly outline the various pieces that we've been doing that, have comprised that work, specifically focusing on the contextualized housing need, the housing production strategy, and the acceleration program. For this contextualized housing need and the HPS program, the program already included seeds of affirmatively furthering fair housing. You all might recall that fair housing is actually one of the factors that are currently outlined in rule for that cities have to consider collectively as part of the actions and ensure that they are meeting fair and equitable housing outcomes as it relates to fair housing. But now through our charge, we've been given the explicit direction to update that in a more meaningful way. So through our discussions, we've introduced the review of the past discriminatory actions and fair housing issue area analysis to the contextualized housing need. This is really stemming from that charge to affirmatively further fair housing. It sets the stage for determining housing types, characteristics, and locations to address those fair housing issues and meet more broader housing needs. And then we've strengthened the HPS by making that connection from the contextualized housing need to the actions selected in HPS. They're talking to each other now, which is great. And we've also clarified engagement as it relates to the entire program by requiring engagement as part of the action selection step of the development of an HPS. We've also been able to distinguish between actions and exploratory work, which Celestina will touch on in more detail later. And now we have a whole new acceleration program built to track production, monitor progress on cities' HPS work, and provide the support that they need to continue the really good work on the ground on housing production, affordability, and choice. So with that, that's all. I mean, that's tall order we've all been doing. So kudos to you all. In this third iteration, I'm going to highlight kind of the significant changes that I'm sure you all already dug into. This is the draft rules were included in the agenda packet. And so I'm just going to touch on these very briefly. We've made multiple adjustments to the definition section of the rules in particular, but I do want to highlight three new definitions specifically for environmental justice, housing acceleration agreement, and the midpoint report. These are definitions that were added based on feedback received around a desire to offer more clarity in the rules, given these terms were being used. So that's our intention with that. Then for the contextualized housing need adoption and review process, you might have noticed that there is now a third pathway added here, informed from the department's legal counsel in Rule Draft 3. And this third option for adopting the contextualized housing need is for cities that are eligible for the sequential UGB process. They may adopt the contextualized housing need as an element of a work plan, which is required as part of that UGB amendment process. And so there's just that additional opportunity. All of these three, though, I will note, are still kind of under review by our legal counsel. And we're waiting to hear more on feedback from them specifically. And so we're kind of tied to these options now. But of course, if we welcome feedback around these pathways, of course, always. Then for action flexibility, we've been having a lot of discussion at the RAC level. We've heard discussion here about the desire to ensure there's flexibility offered to local governments. And so that has taken a shape in better defining an action, and we've updated that action. And by adding a opportunity for a city to define an alternate option or an alternate action and include that as part of their HPS. And so now there's a primary action, there's a alternate action that can be implemented to meet the HPS requirements and offer that flexibility that local governments desire or seek or in this program. We've revised the midpoint report review rule a little bit to kind of remove the requirement for cities to submit a request separately to adjust their actions before the report. Now the midpoint report acts as that point in time where cities can identify a change request of those actions if they are in the middle of their process and seeing that maybe a primary action or an alternate action isn't, addressing the need that they outlined in their submittal of their HPS originally. Then moving on to the engagement sections, I just want to note here that we've clarified the sections in the program and the rules generally to be laid out more better, to be more responsive, and to really outline the expectations of cities in the engagement section. And then lastly, the last note I want to make here on the third iteration of rules is around safe harbors and adoption ready actions. We've had long conversations about the concept of safe harbors in the HPS and acceleration program as part of our rulemaking process here and in the RAC. At the RAC meeting in September, there was an extensive discussion around the use of safe harbors and really culminating around the discussion really culminated around folks interested in the use of safe harbors. But potentially the rulemaking process needing a little bit more time to work on that was desired. So in this third iteration, what we adjusted was removing the safe harbor type mix. That is no longer in draft rules. And we did not introduce additional safe harbors for housing characteristics or location, specifically with the needs identification. So that is something to note there. But instead, because there is a strong interest and desire to continue to think about, to talk about safe harbors and, pathways for compliance around the adoption ready actions, staff added a new section of rule within the 200s, 210, I believe, that's labeled adoption ready actions. And this is kind of our place for us to continue to work through this particular topic in 2025. So you all know this, that we've always had it in our work plan that we have a third topic area to develop adoption ready actions. And we're going to shift to that after the adoption of our first phase of the rules, and we're adding this additional component to continue the discussion around safe harbors and minimum compliance if our legal team finds that that is within our statutory direction. We're going to continue that work in 2025 as part of our charge in our TAC. So with that, I'm going to pause, and Celestina and I can answer any questions or clarify anything for y'all before we start digging into the focus discussion.
Any questions about changes in third draft? Okay. I think if questions come up in discussion, we can, of course, address
Totally.
those along the way, but let's carry on then. Celestina, I think that's you.
Sure. Thanks, Deb. Okay, thank you so much, Mari, for the wonderful framing and overview of the changes in Draft Rules 3.0 from our last version, from the second draft. So moving into discussion, as both Deb and Mari mentioned, we will be discussing the details of the rules related to the contextualized housing next week and focusing this week on the rules of the housing production strategy itself. So I'll just go over some of the high points of the housing production strategy rules here, and then we have 3 different areas of discussion. So, of course, we have community engagement, as mentioned in terms of the 3.0 refinements. The community engagement as both a part of the contextualized housing need and the housing production strategy still exists. And in the housing production strategy, the requirements are still there to, intentionally do engagement, to have summaries and reflections about what is heard, and then even to bring that information all the way through to the actions that are being selected. So that component is there, and I'm trying not to get too far into our discussion questions themselves, but really what we've been grappling with over time in the TAC is what is the right balance of engagement, and how do we frame it, and what are the requirements around that. Additionally, we have the heart of the HPS itself, which is the actions. So the actions, of course, are informed by community engagement and also the contextualized housing need generally, and they are responsive to the contextualized housing need, and then take that action and put it on the ground with specific work that the city is committing to do. And so in that, there's a rule section related to really what constitutes an action. And that has a number of elements that the city will note in their HPS to build out that action. Some of them are, just basic descriptions about what is this action, but also project management oriented items like timelines, the critical steps to accomplish it, how the action itself and its outcomes will be tracked. Some of those are statutorily directed, particularly some of the timeline items. And then another piece in there is the analysis of benefits and burdens. And one of the reasons we're highlighting that out of kind of that whole list of things that comprise an action is because we haven't talked about it very much here in the NAPTAC. It is specifically an analysis of that action, that, action by action, how does this action potentially benefit and burden these particular communities. Now, this piece of rule is actually already in the existing Division 8 rules. And we've already seen some of this work happen in existing housing production strategies that have already come down the pike. But nonetheless, wanted to just highlight it here as we're reviewing this section, like Maddie mentioned, that we just haven't spent a lot of time with here in the TAC. And then, of course, in the HPS, as we've been iterating and finding the right approach to manage both actions and exploratory work, an HPS could also include exploratory work if a city wanted to designate that, as part of their workflow and kind of work plan, and just kind of the transparency of these are the things we're committing to, and these are the things we're going to look into and are interested in. So that's kind of the overview of the housing production strategy. And with that, to just keep drilling down a little bit more and a little bit more, we'll go to the first discussion question to unpack that in community engagement portion of the rule. So for the most part at this stage, we know that we have a number of interests and goals to balance. And so a lot of the questions at this stage in the rule writing is how are we doing on that balance, on these trade-offs? So we know that with community engagement, the importance of having community members actually have decision-making influence is really important. And that's why, primary reason that we do community engagement work. And at the same time, there can be engagement fatigue of community members participating in those engagement activities and outreach. So there's a balance point there. And not only the community members, but also the local jurisdiction, the city or county who's doing this work, also has resource and capacity constraints. And so when we consider these rules and we consider what the right balance is, we're looking to you all to weigh in and say at this point, with the various iterations of community engagement and what we have in draft 3.0, how do you think we're landing in terms of balancing those interests, both having the voices of community members most affected really centered and valued and acted upon, while also acknowledging capacity on both the participants and the local government side. And if there are areas, or if you don't think that that balance has quite been struck, also at this point in the rule writing, we'd be especially interested in, a particular alternative, because with the time that we have left, just really looking kind of concretely at if this isn't quite what the right balance is, then what might that be? So with that, that's our first topic. And Deb, if you have anything to add before we dig in.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much. So talking specifically about the engagement parts of the rules, the engagement, rules around engagement, as Celestina just outlined. How is this coming off to you as a balance? Is it feel like it's balanced better or about right? Do you see some ways to alleviate engagement fatigue and also make sure that communities who are most affected have influence on decisions? Other thoughts? Please. Yeah. Hi, Kathy. Go ahead. Oh, you're on mute. And Madi, maybe you can take down the slides for a moment so we can see each other. That would be great. Thanks.
I think the first thing we have to do is to figure out how to convince the community that this is serious and that they're going to be able to have an impact. Because I think although we have been focusing on this for a year now, I don't think anybody who's in the community really has any understanding of what's at stake and what's required and what the opportunity is that they can participate in. And until we get that word out and get some credibility, I think it's going to be difficult to get people engaged.
So I think what I'm hearing you, I definitely hear you on that front. And I think what I'm hearing is more programmatic needs, maybe from the state, also from all the local folks and our partners. Anything in rule that you think needs to be shifted to help with that, or have you given that thought? Okay. All right. Thank you, Kathy. Matt, please go ahead.
So I think I can build a little bit on Kathy's comment as well. One thing that I think the rules could specifically do to help with community engagement is to actually, or to provide some definition of what community engagement actually means, because it's referred to, engagement's referred to like 40 times in the rule, and community engagement a few times. But I think it could also help sort of set the standard for what cities need to be doing, or what that activity actually means. So I'm going to drop in the chat what I think could be a definition of community engagement. But I think, essentially it means not just soliciting views and recommendations, but I think it should also be clear that cities are considering those views and recommendations, and that they have a process for incorporating those views and recommendations in the planning process and decisions and outcomes. For example, incorporating a process for incorporating such views might include actually responding to those comments. I think a lot of times people get a sense of disengagement from these processes when they submit comments and they hear nothing. Was the comment considered? Was it even read? And that can be a source of disengagement, particularly among the disability community. So I'm going to drop this definition in the chat, and it comes from the proposed rulemaking around federal affirmatively furthering fair housing. So I didn't just cut this out of whole cloth. It's got some consideration already going at the federal level as incorporating this community engagement definition.
Thanks, Matt. And just sorry to clarify on that point, are you hoping DLCD considers that for an addition of a definition within the rules, or just as information for guidance on engagement that will come later?
I think it should be a definition of the rule.
Okay, thank you.
And I sent that to Ingrid.
Okay, great. We can get that out. Thank you. Nathan, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Deb. I think I missed the last one, so this might be slightly off, but on community engagement, just as my organization is doing a lot of community engagement in Hillsborough around 10th Avenue, and community engagement fatigue is real. Just want to say that. And I'll just also say, I think there's enough research now on community engagement to show that it heavily skews towards people who have time and resources. And so I will say I'm just a tad skeptical of the whole theory of community engagement for some of this work. I feel like we have elections and we have elected officials that people hold accountable through their vote, which is something most people do have time to do. And I worry about how much community engagement skews toward the very specific demographic, often retired people who have time to spend voicing their opinions. And so I don't know if that's applicable here, but I just want to voice that I'm a little skeptical that this is really a good way to make decisions. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. And before I move on, Alan, I'd appreciate hearing from anyone else from cities or counties who are also doing this work, and sort of what they might think are some solutions there, or if the rule needs to be more specific about that. Alan, thank you.
Well, just a reflection of my time at the city of Portland when I was there, that older adults are often people showing up at neighborhood association meetings, and it does skew toward the homeowner side of things. So I think Nathan's right when he's identifying that. I think that there's a need for broadly supporting people, who are not available, who might have caregiving responsibilities in particular. And I think that's where I want to land on where community engagement falls short. So for instance, things like climate planning, the CPEC project, older adults, people with disabilities, and caregivers, including caregivers of children or sandwich caregivers like myself who are caring for aging parents and young kids, are critically important to talk to. So I was in a Governor's Commission on Senior Services meeting the other day, and the unpaid caregiver cost in Oregon is larger than the Oregon DHS budget, right? We spend over $6 billion on unpaid caregiving. We need to figure out a way to incorporate those voices in the work that we're doing. And I saw this in climate planning, that they were basically lost in the shuffle, and people who were caring for individuals were not a part of conversations. And so it's part of the disability data. When we look at ACS community data, looking at going out alone and supportive living or independent living as part of our disability definition. So I just want to highlight the importance of caregivers as part of our planning conversation, because they're holding together quite often the hard work we have to do in raising kids, the hard work we're doing in caring for aging parents, and are often not at the table at all because they're stretched in both directions. So I'm not sure if this is something that gets built out in the equitable engagement toolkit, but I feel like it's an area that's often dropped and thought about in the broader kind of work on community engagement.
Thank you for that. Shannon, please go ahead.
Thanks. I think that there is a shared hunger that a lot of us have to review the equitable engagement toolkit. I think that would be probably elucidating. Sorry, new kid moving her dog from Zoom.
Very cute.
Yeah. And at the same time, I think that I'm concerned that maybe engagement is not being contemplated as needing to go hand in hand with action identification and selection. So, I mean, here I am, I'm drinking the water, right? I'm at the Neighborhood Partnerships Conference. I'll be going there. That's why I have to leave early today. And just yesterday, I was hearing wonderful examples of engaged community members who've significantly influenced significant, like hundreds of millions of dollars of investments for Albina Vision, for example. One example, but not the only example, right? I feel like I would love to see resources go to cities or available to cities who are interested in committing to this work. Yeah, not to be North. I should shut her in a room. Resources that would help them to be successful, and along with the toolkit, right? Because it is going to take time. It's going to take an extended commitment of time to connect with. I guess I'm going to use this general term of trusted community leaders. So like thinking about this process, and that maybe there's been this identification through looking at needed housing and the affirmatively fair housing goals and patterns of discrimination, right? That there's this desire to invest in housing development in a certain area of the community. Like, who are the trusted leaders there, and what's it going to take to get to meaningfully engage with those trusted leaders over time, or create a space for that to happen effectively? And are there even case studies, right? Thinking about redevelopment work happening with manufactured home parks in Southern Oregon, mentioned Albina Vision, different places, right? Different groups, but still there's this concerted work over time for a meaningful action with trusted community leaders who are already there. But you may not find them, right, by posting a public meeting once. So that's where I personally think that there needs to be some investment in city capacity in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. And noted about the desire to dig into the equitable engagement toolkit as well. So just sort of reflecting on a few things just heard, one of the questions at hand is the balance right for where the engagement is happening and the level of engagement to avoid the fatigue, but also make sure community members most impacted are not just at the table, but influencing those actions selected. So are the rules sort of spelling that out enough, or is there something else that needs to be done in the actual rule to make sure that desired balance is highlighted? Heard Matt's idea for including potentially a definition that really sort of brackets this or puts some parameters around what this means, and maybe that includes the inclusion of caregivers. Maybe the inclusion of caregivers also belongs in the, well, not maybe, probably also belongs in the equitable engagement toolkit, but where or how or if it needs to show up in rule language or the definition, TBD. And just acknowledging the sort of, well-worn patterns of engagement of the past and how to sort of break out of those patterns and make sure communities, cities, communities, everyone that's doing this work are really talking to the people, again, most impacted by housing need. Did I miss an important piece of that and where we are? Go ahead, Matt, please.
Yeah, I don't think you missed anything critical there, but something I did want to flag is I also think in the rule that the words and phrases community engagement, public engagement, and engagement are used interchangeably and probably have the same meaning. Okay. But if we're going to put a definition to the rule around engagement, either making those references to engagement consistent throughout the rule, like use the same word or phrase, or just simply define the word engagement would probably get at it, instead of just, because community engagement's used twice, engagement's used over 40 times. So I think thinking about what word you're going to define is important.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. So review and tighten up the language and make sure there's some consistency. And I think that probably is needed, and maybe on a couple of fronts, but it's helpful to hear that specifically. Before I move on to Alan, Mari or Celestina, any thoughts on that generally, on the terminology or anything you all have noticed, or does that sound like something that could be done, is going through and making sure there's specificity there?
I think I think the flag for consistency is well heard. I think we want to be consistent, so we'll definitely take a look. And thank you, Matt, for flagging that. The use of the three different ways that we've talked about engagement, but you're right, at the all three do have engagement, so maybe there is opportunity to be consistent throughout. In terms of defining it, I think we're chewing on that. I think we'll want to chew on that, and we do have one of our statewide planning goals is engagement. It's goal 1. So there's something there too for us to think about. One thing I do want to kind of take a moment to ask, and I don't want to call folks out, but I would love to hear specifically from local jurisdictions around this engagement piece, and specifically, the rules outline engagement specific to the action selection piece of the HPS program, and how does that sit for cities? Some of you all are in the middle of an HPS. Some of you will be in the HPS program soon, and some of you already have done the HPS through the pre-ONA rules. So yeah, I just want to invite you all to as the implementers of the HPS program to really, I'm calling you in to hear your thoughts there around engagement, because it is important that I think we are all talking about engagement being as critical, and there's different components within the HPS that engagement is helpful, whether it be ground truthing the quantitative data that happens on the contextualized housing need, or supporting the action selection piece. yeah, I think we're trying to balance it all, and hearing from you all whether that balance feels right would be helpful, and if it doesn't, then what else could we consider?
Thank you, Madi, and just want to sort of tag on to that. One or maybe more than one of you mentioned the need for engagement to be inclusive of cities showing what they've done with the input they've received. And I think the rules start to speak to that, but it'd be good to hear from you on whether that's needing some propping up in some way. So Alan, thank you for your patience. Go ahead.
Just a really brief addition that builds on what Shannon was talking about, which is the importance of involving housing providers, such as those, the CDC providers, but also housing service providers, those folks like Northwest Pilot Project that are getting people from the street into housing through coordinated access, trying to figure out how especially extremely low-income individuals are moving kind of into housing and staying in housing. We struggle sometimes at the local level in having a voice. And so it'd be great to be able to be involved in that, to say, hey, here's what we're experiencing when we see only 2 out of 10 clients coming through our door who we can house. What's happening to those 8 people who we're not housing? That is important information from a housing production strategy perspective, and saying who's falling through the cracks. How do we improve the service delivery in particular? Thanks.
Thank you. And could help to alleviate some of the engagement fatigue for the individuals who are seeking that housing as well.
Yeah, that's kind of under that trusted community leaders kind of place. We're looking for opportunities to be at the table and inform policy and programs. So it's just a matter sometimes of asking those folks who are kind of between clients and systems that have kind of a close look at the perspective of. Anyways, yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. So keep an eye out in rules and guidance about that. Ariel, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just thank you for the call in, Mari and Deb, for jurisdictions. Yeah, I feel pretty comfortable with the way the rulemaking has sort of turned out with an engagement. That I feel like some of what was just sort of already implicit just was made more clear and written. We were being asked to sort of draw those connections between our engagement and our HPS actions as we were writing it over the summer. And I think that this, if it wasn't already written into it, it is now, and that just makes it a little more clear. I don't know that I have any additional items that I would add to this. I think I would caution against getting too much more prescriptive in terms of what engagement has to look like. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that equitable strategy toolkit looks like. I had a couple of ideas about what might go into that. Like I was hearing from Matt that there's some interest in understanding the connection between like the engagement and the influence it has, and some of that will get tied into it. But if there is like a best practice that could be written into the toolkit that helps us move along that sort of influence spectrum, from informing to decision making, I think that could be valuable. As well as I might have missed it, but I don't really see in the list of, potential plans or other housing related engagement policies, connection to houseless households, if there are best practices or toolkit items that could maybe address that as well. That would potentially be helpful for jurisdictions. Yeah, that's what I have for now.
Thank you, Ariel. Very helpful suggestions and things you'd like to see. And then also just helpful to hear your perspective from having just gone through an HPS and sort of where the rule is now. Anyone else wish to weigh in on engagement? Yeah, thank you, Tara. Also a recent experiencer.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I like the intent of everything that's in there right now. I have a lot of curiosity in sort of how it's going to play out in terms of getting diverse communities, underserved communities to really weigh in on specific action items. And that, just sort of because, my experience has been when we do outreach, and I guess I'll use an example. So, currently we have outreach and we're working with non-English speakers who speak 7 different languages. And so we're working through interpreters on some projects we have going on, like our TSP, to get their input. And a lot of the actions in the HPS are very, very technical. Like, you know, it was hard enough for our council to understand what a construction excise tax was and how that could operate. It'd be pretty hard to try and explain the array of actions and get technical through interpreters. And so it's just, I have a lot of curiosity in like how we're going to be able to work out the level of specificity we're going to get, for example, with working through interpreters for input on the action items. And so I think, well, I appreciate everything that's in there. We're just going to have to see how we can best achieve some of the desired outreach.
Good points. Mari, do you have some thoughts on that or questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if it's helpful to offer on that piece, Tara, that we're not prescribing the tactic. I think the engagement toolkit is the resource that local governments can go to for thinking about their program, their engagement program as it relates to action selection. Some cities might have been doing a lot of engagement already and have built the capacity of folks on the ground to participate in the action selection, and maybe that's the right space for them. But then others, like to Alan's point about maybe there's a trusted individual or a leader or community-based organizations that could be the folks to be invited to support the action selection might be the tactic that works best. I think yeah, I think I want to offer that toolkit will offer various tactics that, you know, could be helpful as in kind of the decisions that jurisdictions have to make when thinking about the action selection engagement. I'm not sure if that's helpful, Tara, but just wanted to offer that nugget to you.
Yeah, I mean, we typically do have, for example, a technical advisory committee, which can get more technical and does have a pretty broad representation on it. But I think if the intent is to have sort of broader engagement on action selection, there are elements of it that could be challenging.
And hopefully the toolkit can offer some support there for ways that could be helpful. And I think what you're getting at is right, really like trying to really be responsive or leaning to some of the components that are identified in the racial equity framework, and how do you bring that forward in the engagement program. So I would say engagement is it's an evolution, and leaning in is part of the work. But hopefully that toolkit, and we will continue to evolve the toolkit as, you know, more best promising practices emerge, and as we see more models for what that's for how it's being done in all parts of Oregon, that could be helpful too as a continuous resource for jurisdictions on that front.
Thank you, though, Tara, for bringing that up. I saw some nodding heads. I think there is some sort of figuring this out collectively, and want to acknowledge also an earlier comment about needing additional resources to help through this. Brianne, I'm going to give you the last comment, and then I'm going to move us on to our next topic, but please go ahead.
I would just echo what Tara had brought up too, of like balancing that technical can be really challenging, especially with historically underserved populations and like their time and resources being able to like really do a deep dive. And then overall, I think it's consistent with the direction we're going anyway with our engagement. I don't see any major issues with it. I would just want to point out from like how much time and money that and the impacts, especially on smaller communities, that can have. And not that you shouldn't do it. It's just, can be very resource intensive. And especially, I mean, we're even now looking at like healthy democracies as part of our doing that. That alone is a $250,000 to do that one type of outreach. So just thinking about like the reality of how much time and resources that engagement can cost, and how that integrates into all the other engagement that we're required to do through CFAC and through all of the other rulemaking, just making sure that those are kind of married as much as possible so that we're not duplicating efforts.
Thank you for that perspective. It is really helpful to hear from you all about the things you're juggling and just some of your experiences doing this type of engagement, and even the service and housing providers that are here and your experience on that end of things. So quite a few things for DLCD to chew on as they further refine this and or move into guidance in the engagement toolkit. Moving along in our discussion this morning, I want to make sure we have time to get through everything. Second topic of discussion is about action flexibility. And Mari, if you can pull up the slide on that, and I don't know if it's you or Celestina. I think it's Celestina. Go ahead.
Thank you, Deb. All right, I'll just echo the appreciation for that last conversation. So action flexibility. So similarly to this last question about engagement, we're exploring the right balance between, it's just balance on something different. In this case, it's a balance on the really intention that the housing production strategy is an action plan where local governments are committing to take action based on identified housing needs and, long-standing housing needs that we're all intimately aware of. With the acknowledgement also that actions are preceded by research and preparation, also that actions, sometimes even when committed to, don't end up panning out for one reason or another and may need to pivot. So there are a number of ways that flexibility, beyond just, one moment in time having an absolute commitment to an action from start to finish really is necessary. And again, flexibility on adjusting an action or even potentially flexibility on how we get to that commitment. Like, what does it look like to do exploratory work or research, and how does that interplay with the commitment of an action? So as Mari mentioned, one of the adjustments to the version 3 rules was a little bit more extensive on this item than on community engagement. For the most part, the community engagement revisions were just oriented more to clarity. But in this case, there were some adjustments to be able to include an alternate action within the initial HPS. So in that way, it's something that goes through that same adoption process and has the same amount of visibility and the same approval as that primary action. And in that way, it's kind of pre-approved so that a local government could say, we're aiming for this item, but maybe it feels ambitious, or maybe we feel like there are some specific and significant outstanding questions, and we're not sure if we'll be able to pull it off. So if not, we're pre-identifying this second option, and it meets the same need and is kind of a comparable action. And if in the implementation of the HPS and the actions, we need to pivot to that one, we will. And additional approval is not required from DLCD, and no kind of additional process really either. Additionally, the existing Division 8 rule around the ability to request an action change is preserved, but like Mari mentioned, would occur as part of the midpoint review if needing a change in an action. And then that research and kind of exploratory work item in this version 3 is maintained as an optional part of the HPS if a jurisdiction wants to name and plan for, those research and studies to help, again, have transparency and kind of collective community understanding about this work, but is still distinct from those things that are a local jurisdiction is saying, we're actually going to do this, in this HPS cycle, this 6 or 8 year period. So those things remain actions, whereas the research is welcomed and encouraged and just like notated as such in the housing production strategy. So the question that we have is, how is that balance? We've seen a number, probably 2, 3 different arrangements of how to allow that flexibility as we've iterated the rules. So how is that feeling? And if there are other suggestions, if it's not seeming like we've quite landed on something workable, then what other suggestions do you have?
Thank you for lining us out on that, Celestina. So yeah, how are the revisions sort of sitting with you, trying to encourage cities to be innovative and sort of push the boundaries, but also not penalize them if in the pushing of those boundaries, they realize something's infeasible, and giving it other options up front. Matt, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a really great addition to the version 3 of the rules, the way it's described, because I think one issue that would concern me is if a lot of the identified housing needs probably, I should say some of the identified housing needs are going to need more than just one action. And I think some jurisdictions might sort of default to one action for each need, just to kind of simplify their housing production strategy process. But I think this helps encourage thinking about more than one action, and the fact that it could help avoid frankly, kind of the hassle of going to amend an action or change an action, makes it incentivizes, thinking about multiple actions to solve a housing need. So I think it's pretty well thought out.
Great, thank you. Mary Kyle, thoughts on this one?
I agree with Matt. I like this, and I also think that some housing needs, there's probably going to be several actions integrated, a need for that because of the overlapping needs of housing needs of populations. And, some year, 2, 3 down the line, a city might find that, this one element isn't really doing what we thought it would be doing. So we want to put in this other element and integrate it into this package kind of a thing. So I like that flexibility, but I like that it's all pre-thought out, so that community members know, because in terms of community fatigue, it's really hard to then have the community to engage when something's changing partway through its implementation. And that can really feel dishonest to community members, because they're not going to understand and they may see it as weakening. But if that is all upfront in the beginning, I think that's really helpful. And as the agency refines the housing production strategies and the model ordinances and adoption-ready actions, which I think maybe are different words for kind of the same stuff, which is one of my questions for later. I think there'll just be more and more tools that are pretty much almost ready to go and to be integrated into a city's housing production strategies. Thanks.
Thank you for that, and for the additional insights about the impacts, the positive impacts on the engagement program, and how that can really help folks understand the full spectrum of things up front. Rachel, please go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to echo that. I really see the value in these changes. They're great. I just wanted to call out quickly that the culturally relevant features list a couple specific things, and I just want to, I don't know if that's intentional, but to me it sounds a little bit like boxing in options. And so just wanted to raise that as food for thought.
Can you provide, I'm seeing quizzical faces and I have a little quizzical face too. Can you provide a specific section you're looking at, Rachel?
Yeah, so in the oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's the characteristics definition.
Got it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's characteristics definition, just section 6 and then subset F.
Yeah, so I'll take a moment to speak to it, and then maybe I think, Deb, looks like we're okay on time, so we will probably still have at least 15 minutes at the end for some of these other lingering pieces that don't quite fit into our topics, but I think we're here. So if it's okay with you, Deb, I'll just speak for a moment to it. That list is not meant to be exhaustive, but it is meant to say these are things that we know of, to be aware of, to look into, kind of like a starter list on things that you might ask about in your community engagement. And like I said, not exhaustive or limiting. That being said, that's always the question and kind of the risk in these definitions is what is the balance between trying to prompt some things that we do know and we are aware of without creating a situation that seems limiting or has a limiting effect. So I think that the question is really valid.
Great, thank you. And there will definitely, I mean, unless the wheels come off here in the next few minutes, I could anticipate we'll have plenty of time to pick up anything else in the rules you'd like to touch on today. But circling back really quickly to see if there's any other comments you all wish to add about action flexibility. And if we've heard some support for how things have changed. If you're not feeling as excited about that, we would love to hear about that now, just so we can understand if there's some refinements that need to be made. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I guess, one slight hesitancy about alternative actions might be that whereas a city might be required, like a city might actually need to undertake, let's say, X, Y, and Z to address a housing need, does the inclusion of alternative actions mean they're only going to name X in their housing production strategy as an action and then name Y and Z as alternative actions? And would that impact DLCD's ability to hold them accountable? And I guess that's about as far as I've got in that thought process. But I think that there might be a nuance there where cities might list things as alternative actions where maybe they should be primary actions.
Yeah. Oh, you just muted off, but yes, thank you. I think you have voiced some of that sort of push and pull in our brains here. Sort of how do you find that balance? And I think that is, a risk. Maybe it's small, but it's definitely something I think staff have been thinking about. Madi, other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just want to offer that the city is held to the addressing the housing need, and not to the action, which I think is what you're seeing is the flexibility with the primary and the secondary and the exploratory work. So what we are looking for is that the city is working to address that housing, the collective housing needs that are identified in their contextualized housing need. So we would be looking at that in our review in terms of what a city is held accountable to.
Are they meeting need and the outcomes itself? Yeah. Brock, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, just while thinking about the alternatives piece, Rule 230, and I think I included this in my notes, but just want to make sure that it's flagged for 1A and B. Instead of a metropolitan service district boundary, it should be metro, since that's how it's written in the bill. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Any other items on action flexibility, or are we ready to move on to the specific action requirements? Okay. And we'll have time at the end if you want to circle back to this after this next discussion for some reason, we can always do that as well. Great. All right, Madi, please pull up the discussion slide, and Celestine, I'll hand it to you.
Okay, last focus area here today is
Next
that,
slide. Sorry,
oh, sorry.
just the next slide. Oh, you've
Oh,
got
yes.
it. Sorry. Thank you. Great.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deb. Is this portion of the rules, again, that is applies to each action. So that's what we mean when we say action by action. This list of items is required, really in terms of building out and describing in some ways, or in some instances, even being accountable to inputs like community engagement. Like we mentioned earlier, we haven't spent a lot of time on this in the NAPTAC, so I'm particularly curious to hear thoughts from everyone on the call on this. And generally, in approaching this list, the things that we're considering are one, as we've heard today, that the contextualized housing need work and engagement specific to action selection is supposed to inform action selection. So there are some points in that list of items where that drawing that through line is made explicit. What fair housing issues or what types, characteristics, and locations, and what community engagement is informing and leading to this action. Additionally, the actions are intended to achieve fair and equitable housing outcomes. So there are questions like, what kinds of households is this action intended to serve? And really getting toward this goal of achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes. And then also that these are actions in an action plan. So, those project management oriented items, if I might call them that, like timeline considerations, strategy kind of around the action. Like there's an item about if there are any other complementary actions. I think maybe a little bit getting at one of your points, Matt, about how really there might be two things that both need to be accomplished, and even that they might inform one another, and having an opportunity to illustrate those strategic choices or well, I should say, and an example of that could be, development incentive with anti-displacement, action, intentionally marrying those two. So getting into the details a little bit on examples, but really just that this list is intended to bring meaning, a pretty high level of meaningfulness to the action selection process and looking at these actions cohesively as a strategy overall. And also, we want to make sure that the list accomplishes that, is meaningful, is worthwhile, that everything in this list, has value and isn't extraneous or onerous and needs to be pulled out, or if there's anything that we're missing. So I covered a lot there, mostly because we haven't had a chance to talk much about it. So I'm curious, on any of those levels, if you all have thoughts about how these actions are kind of built out and detailed in the rules for the housing production strategy.
Thank you, Celestina. Do you have handy, or can you tell us offhand the rules section specifically that this is in for those referencing?
Yes, let's see. It would be in the housing production strategy structure, which is Rule 200.
Great.
And then let's see the subsection. Oh, I just went right past it.
Subsection 2.
Actions to meet
Yes.
current and future housing need. Great.
Exactly.
Thank you. This was a late add to the agenda, so I just wanted to make sure everyone was tracking. Great, thank you so much. So for those of you who have dug into this before, or even just sort of understanding, as Celestina just outlined, what are your thoughts at this point on the requirements for how actions get built out here? Is it about right? Is something not quite right? I see a thumbs up. That's a good start. Thank you, Brock. giving
Yeah,
everyone.
this is why we haven't discussed it much.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just giving a little, I'm stalling a little bit here because I'm guessing you all didn't read this fresh this morning. So just trying to make sure we have time here. Alan, go ahead.
I've got a very specific kind of question that jumps out when we're looking at location-based kind of areas. So I've been advocating for the idea of accessible and affordable housing in CFEX, and I see in the rules that OHCS ORCA defined high opportunity areas are the other area that we might be looking to focus development. And I don't know much about the ORCA definitions, but this gets to the flexibility question. So in a place like Portland, where centers and corridors and main streets are being kind of focused on as a metropolitan planning organization framework for growth, what if that ORCA definition for high opportunity area doesn't map what Portland is calling a center that would essentially be a 20-minute neighborhood? Is there flexibility here in the rules to say, we're looking at that designation that's occurring in Portland as an area where this type of development will happen in lieu of ORCA defined high opportunity areas? And that's where this flexibility could kind of make more sense, because we're at the local level defining things differently than the state level.
And maybe I'm hearing in that question, correct me if I'm wrong about this, Alan, is sort of, yeah, what are your high opportunity areas of the future that you're anticipating, not just maybe what's on the ground?
Yeah, and that maybe at the local level, there's kind of a better understanding of what those are because of this work that's constantly going on in planning departments, rather than state defined areas that might be focused on housing in particular, rather than thinking about the confluence of, factors that a local jurisdiction might prioritize. So I like that this is in here in the action. Just want to make sure that there's enough flexibility to not force our hand to say, oh, it has to be a CFEC or it has to be a higher opportunity area, when we might also say this is actually the area that has the best set of conditions that are going to make sense for this particular housing.
Alan, could you clarify which portion of the rules you're digging into?
And I should say I'm using the kind of cheat sheet here, in that I was looking at the implementation considerations that were drawn up and updated on September 30th, so the 5-page document. And perhaps I shouldn't be doing this, but it's kind of proposed adoption ready model ordinance to support accessibility, which is where I kind of zoomed in.
That makes sense. Yeah, just to, offer clarity there for you and for others. At the moment, that is a almost like a tracking sheet of things that we've heard. So it's not necessarily things that are committed to or that have been vetted or that we've decided this is exactly how it's going to go. It's more almost, if we can try and do our best to practice showing back to community what we've heard and where that might go. That's kind of the practice there, is to say none of these things quite fit under the rules that we're currently drafting and the scope and the role of the OARs, but we have heard them, and there may be opportunity to consider them as we develop, adoption ready actions and other guidance documents and supports. So not to say that your additional notes today aren't, of course we're taking notes and we're hearing them. And that work would be in kind of the guidance development and the adoption ready action development. If opportunity areas, do end up getting defined in a more formal way, I think all of the questions that you raised about what are those, who decides what opportunity areas are, based on what information, forward looking or backward looking, I think those are all really important questions, and part of why we can't answer them this year, but very important questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
One thing that jumps out to me in this section is I like that it specifies that the housing production strategy must include an adoption year for each action and a year when the action is to be implemented. I like those sections. My suggestion would be, is there a way to build out a little bit more specificity about determining years for actions, or determining when the action will be implemented? For example, like you know, an adoption year for the action commensurate with the housing need and urgency, or something like that, or a year when the action will be implemented commensurate with, you know, the urgency and need. I like the sequencing of actions is good, but I think I've just, you know, seen in at least one housing production strategy that accessible housing would be flagged as a need, and that inventory of the accessible housing needs to occur before production occurs. And then I see that the inventory is not even going to start till 2027. And that concerns me. It's like, if this is an urgent problem, and the sequencing of actions will delay production into 2029, I think we have a problem. So I think the rules could say more about the adoption year, or the year for when actions should be implemented. I think it'll be challenging to create kind of a universal, you know, rule considering the scope of different actions, but I think more could be said.
Okay, thank you for that. Thinking about, especially, I'm hearing the urgency of need, and how that might be described. Mary Kyle.
Thanks. I really support what Matt said about calibrating and phasing what needs to be addressed first, the most urgent things, not just necessarily the easiest thing to get done first, but what really needs to be taken care of first. I like in the rule words like commitment to specific actions that collectively meet the 6 or 8 year housing need, et cetera, those strong words, because in reviewing, which is really skimming, housing production strategies so far that have been adopted prior to these rules, many of them are a little mushy to me on commitment. There's great strategies laid out, but it's a little hard for me to tell what an individual city is committing to do and when. So I really like that being built into here. And just for my own clarification, so we have the housing production strategies. Our action, what are we calling these? Adoption ready actions. Are those like model ordinances? Are those like further refinements of a housing production strategy? Because a lot of those strategies right now are things like, you know, bonus density bonus for affordable housing, but how that, you know, I'm not sure we have model ordinances, or maybe we do, but we could have model ordinances in specific language. I'm picking the easiest one that comes to mind to me, or, you know, but it's it's 100 different things listed in the housing production strategy so far. So are the model ordinances and adoption ready actions sort of variations on the same thing of actual more specific what a housing production strategy is?
So the first part, the answer is yes. In terms of what an actual housing production strategy is, I'll hold that one for a moment. But in short, I would say that model ordinances are a subset of adoption ready actions. So and really are a subset of actions generally. So
not all are,
whatever actions the department is able to develop into adoption readiness just means that you know, like you said, there is a model ordinance, there's a model program manual, you know, that says this, you could stand up this program. It's not necessarily limited to ordinance or code. So yes, actions are in the HPS. Some of those actions might be code or ordinances, and any of the actions that are developed in sort of an off-the-shelf adoption way, whether model ordinances or other programming, would be adoption ready actions. And I think the reason we've been using that term is that in the conversations about safe harbors and whatnot, is that having adoption ready actions kind of makes some of these pathways where we say, well, you could do it this way a little bit more clear if those actions are made to be adoption ready.
And then in the accountability phase, there's also talk about use of model ordinances or things like that. So just consistency of terminology and definitions across the boards. That'd be and I realize these are still getting refined, the things that you were just talking about, but that would be really useful. Thanks.
Agreed.
Thank you. That's a good flag too, to look at the language in those sections and make sure we're using consistency there. Mari, did you have anything more to add or on that? Are we good? Okay, great.
Celestina got it.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brock.
Yeah, and tagging on to what Matt and Mary said, I agree with the intent of what they're saying, right? If you have a more urgent need that needs to be addressed, then you want to front load that. But I think the language as it is currently written is easier. Well, I think it creates potentially less unintended consequences because we want to sequence actions in the way that makes them the most effective, right? But I think at the same time, we don't want to say, okay, this is something that we can do easily, so we should do it later so that we can front load this other thing. I think those can be done in conjunction. And I think adding language about urgency potentially creates a situation where they're like, okay, well, we need to do everything to like front load the planning here, and then we're going to put these other actions that we could do now later, just because of that. So all that to say, I agree with the intent, but I think the language is written is the right way to go.
Yeah, Matt, you have a question about that or additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, just an additional thought on that would be they don't necessarily, the added wording around like urgency or scope of need when considering timelines doesn't necessarily need to be prescriptive either. It could be more like, here's factors to consider, factors including but not limited to urgency of need, scope of need, and listing them in that way so as to not, hem in jurisdictions kind of agency and just determining the sequencing of actions too much.
Oh, that better. Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
That's helpful. Yeah, even just thinking some actions may take additional resources to be marshaled before they can pull those together. So having some guidance, but also some wiggle room there are areas to consider. Cities, how are you feeling about the action development section here? Concerns based on what you've seen or done already?
Oh, sorry, I
Go ahead,
unmuted
Ariel.
instead of
Yep.
raising my hand. Sorry,
No problem.
instinct. Yeah, no, I'm feeling good about where the actions have landed, just sort of off of the conversation happening around what we should consider in terms of timing. Just there's just so much that goes into determining when an action is going to take place, and a lot of it is political and not just resource oriented, unfortunately. So, I mean, I think adding those suggestions for consideration without being prescriptive would be the best way to go. I did have a little bit of a question, if I could, about the difference between, I'm not going to get the subsection correct, but where it says an analysis of the income and demographic populations that the city anticipates to receive benefit or burden from the action. And then it lists 3 particular communities and how that is different per se from the sort of addressing the income, tenure, and other impacts, sort of a little bit above that, maybe. And maybe I just need to spend a little bit more time with it, but.
Maybe I'll start us off and then Maddie, you jump in too.
Sure.
This is a great question. And as we were kind of going over this portion of the rule, one of the ways that we realized the rule might be shaping up is that most of this action by action section might be describing the benefit, but maybe what's left is that the burdens have not yet been identified. So because of those other items, we're saying, how will this, what communities might this benefit, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think definitely interested in others' thoughts, interested in what you have to add, Mari, but since this came from Division 8 rules currently, we're seeing that maybe it plays out a little differently, to your point.
I was just going to note the piece about this particular benefits and burdens analysis being something existing in rule, and it's in that action section. And yeah, recently we've been thinking about, how that is interplaying with what we've refined in this list. So I think to your point and to what Celestina just said, I think we're thinking about, where the gap is, and maybe the gap is really on the burden side. And what that shapes up to. I'd be curious to also hear if folks have thoughts here, too.
Just as a clarifying question, that same provision there, when we say analysis, are we talking something like a study, or are we saying a like narrative explanation?
I think that, it is an intentional, like leaning into, like it's,
Because I guess like
sitting,
a theoretical analysis versus like a data analysis, I guess, are two kind of different. Like a thought experiment, like, hey, this is why we think this is going to benefit or burden these groups, versus like, it's going to change this by this much for this group, kind of thing.
I think the intent originally here with the benefits and burdens analysis is just a missing piece about just like is trying to hone in on just equity work generally, and thinking about the decisions put forward, whether the policies in place ultimately have an impact, and what that impact is, whether negative, positive. And so that could take many forms. I think it can be, I think the latitude is there for local jurisdictions to grapple with, but it is really kind of trying to ensure that actions, are thoughtfully are being put together thoughtfully, right? And kind of prevent some of the historical harms that maybe we've seen in the past when, intent and thought isn't there, or maybe just another opportunity to step back and say, are the collective actions really, addressing need, and also leading to positive benefits. And if not, and there might not be and there might be a not, then how does a city think about the other areas of opportunity to mitigate? So it could take shapes and forms differently, but I think and in this 2023 round we saw variations of that. The additional pieces of the contextualized housing need might help in this work a little bit more. So I think it could be both, I guess. There's latitude.
Ariel, and then I'll go to Rachel.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess this might be more of a rhetorical question. I don't know. I guess in terms of this, I know that sentence exists in the current rule. And with the additional other fair housing items, I'm just curious if what you did see from communities in your reviews, if that piece was addressed sufficiently in the current rule, and then if there's something that could be added or shifted to address whatever you might have felt that gap was, even with these additional fair housing items. I don't know what that is, or if there is of that.
Maybe rhetorical at this point, but food for thought. Rachel, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I actually, my comment is a little bit going along with that. I'm just kind of looking at this, trying to look at it, because this is not my area of expertise. So I'm very curious about it. Other people and people representing cities and their opinions on this is looking at the wording from the standpoint of clear and objective standards, and just making sure that what's in there is flexible enough, but also clear and objective enough, so there's no legal challenges we run into in the future. And I really, like I was saying, it's not my area of expertise, but something that I know is an issue generally.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing from staff and from you all as well is just sort of, I think everyone's grasping what's desired here. It's trying to find the right sort of level of effort and that level of clarity, so that cities and communities can respond to this adequately, but also right-sized. Other thoughts or ideas on that, specifically how to make that work, or any other part of this section 202? All right. We have 10-ish minutes, probably a little bit more if needed, to talk about other parts of the housing production strategy rule that you have comments on that we haven't captured. And again, we'll focus on contextualized housing need next meeting. So if we can steer away from that specifically, that would be helpful. But thinking about the rest of the rules, there's something else that has struck you in your review of the 3 versions along the way, or in the conversation today, that you didn't have a chance to highlight yet, that you want to make sure we know about? Yeah, Kathy, please.
I was just, as I was reading through all the attachments, there was a word used as tags. I'm not sure I understand what a tag is.
Yep. Mari or Celestina, do you want to answer that? And maybe there's some strengthening in the rule language as well, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was thinking that, Kathy, you were referring to not the rule language, and maybe more referring to some of the supplementary documents. Kind of, Alan brought one up earlier, which is, and Celestina, you might have to help me with the names that we've applied to these. I think it's implementation. There was one on implementation and considerations, and then one for the guidebook, I think specifically that we're rolling out. And these are just us collecting all of the really great feedback and noting them there on various the feedback we've received and where it could live, or whether it's in the guidebook area of our work that we'll be shifting to, or maybe it's something we hold space for. It doesn't live in the rule itself, but there could be other avenues. It's important thought, but don't want to lose it, so we're holding on to it. In terms of tags, though, to answer your question, I think you're referring to tagging. I think it's referring to the work that is ahead of us, which is in 2025, and related to the update of the housing production strategy menu of actions. And, we've had a lot of discussion. Y'all have brought up a lot of feedback about the opportunity to revamp that menu. And when we're talking about tags, we're talking about revamping it in a manner that maybe connects the contextualized housing need. So fair housing issues being tagged or being aligned with the actions that are outlined in the HPS menu. But really it's like, in our work to revamp that, it could be a reorganization, and what those tags look like might evolve beyond that. It's really trying to get that menu to be a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit more helpful to cities in connecting issues or connecting need to particular actions. So that's what we mean by tagging. Celestina, anything else there that you might want to offer?
If you have a research background, you might use the word coding, coding the actions by, different themes. That's all that's meant. Yeah.
Kathy, is that helpful to your question there? Does that clarify? Okay.
Thank you. Rachel, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. In the definition section under multifamily housing, it defines or it specifies that the housing must be on the same lot, basically. I know that's from the code. I think we talked about this before. But I just wanted to bring it up because a lot of times multifamily housing is located on separate lots that do not get consolidated at development. Don't want them to run afoul of the language unintentionally.
Could I ask you a follow-up on that, Rachel? I think we've heard and are familiar with examples where maybe there are 3 or 4 lots or more, however many, in a somewhat large development, and that those lots may, of course, not all be merged at any point. But on any given lot, do you think that there are still fewer than 5 units, even if the development overall has more units and more lots? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, there could be. It's also complicated because in some situations you might have a building that's 7/8 on one lot and 1/8 on another lot. And then there's, a portion of 6 units. And how do you count that on that other lot?
Right.
So yeah, it's not cut and dry.
Buildings and lots don't always line up. Yeah. Maybe often don't line up. Okay, thank you for pointing that out. Brock, please go ahead.
I think maybe this is just something that was duplicated, but in Rule 75 for the contextualized housing need, both 1E and 2E are about the number that would be needed in a CFA to make it accommodate 30%. It seems to make sense in 1, but 2 is more specifically about engagement feedback. So I think that was just like a extra copy paste kind of thing, but just wanted to.
I think we had figured that out earlier. Is that correct? Yeah, I'm seeing the
Thanks,
knife.
Brock. Yeah, it was an error, but thank you nonetheless. Please
Yeah.
keep them coming.
Yeah, I think it was accidentally added in one, then picked up in the other, and then deletion forgotten. So we'll fix that for sure. Matt.
Yeah, I had a couple comments. The first comment is, I did notice in the definition sections that it has a definition for multi-unit housing and it has a definition for middle housing. I think that there are a lot of other housing types that should be defined in the rule, but they're not. It's logical that they're not defined because they're not referenced in the rule, and I think that kind of leads me to one of my other comments, which is that in general, I think I don't like the fact that Safe Harbors section was kind of postponed until 2025, although I understand why, because there was a lot of potentially unintended consequences there. But I think the result is we have these terms, multi-unit housing, middle housing, in the definition sections that aren't used anywhere in the rule. Hopefully, I guess what I'm trying to say is I hope we use those types. I hope we use those words as we move forward. And hopefully that's a reflection of our intention to use them moving into 2025. But maybe it was just we didn't get rid of them because we forgot. I hope that we're going to use them. And to that point, I think that thinking about the adoption ready actions in 2025, that it is an opportunity to reconsider the idea that DLCD make minimum standards part of the rules. And I do think that DLCD should consider returning to that question. I also feel that in my reading of the scope of the Building Codes Division's authority, that I don't know that they've characterized their authority accurately. They've sort of elicited implied that local jurisdictions can't make any building code because local building code standards because it's preempted by the state building code. Well, it's not exactly the case. I mean, the case is actually that local jurisdictions can request exemptions to the state building code. And if a housing need identified in the housing production strategy can't be met with the existing state building code, they should make those requests for exceptions or exemptions to create local standards. And I think that could be incorporated into the rule, possibly in the adoption ready actions that work next year. The other thing too is I think the Building Codes Division has a very broad idea of matters addressed in the state building code, so that it acts as if local jurisdictions can't create like visitability standards. Well, visitability is not addressed anywhere in the state building code. It's not required under the structural specialty code. It's not contained at all. And there are no accessibility standards in the residential specialty code. So it's not a matter addressed by the state building code. Local jurisdictions should be free to set those standards. Maybe that'll lead to a court case, but I think that local jurisdictions should be able to do that. So that's a couple comments. I think the last thing I wanted to mention, because I don't think it falls under contextualized housing need, so I'm not sure we're going to get to it next week, is the issue of under the auditing and referrals into the housing acceleration program. The focus of referring is based on the midpoint report. I'm a little surprised that the referrals are very squarely focused on the success and development of affordable housing. Essentially, has a city built the net needed housing for affordable incomes below 80% AMI. It doesn't address, I think that there are other factors that should play into whether a city gets referred into the housing acceleration program. Specifically for people with disabilities, is a city producing the needed accessible housing? Where the statute says affordable, it almost always also refers to accessible housing. So I think that should be a consideration when referring cities into the housing acceleration program. Are they producing enough accessible housing? And I think, another place that could be represented is in prioritizing referrals. Underproduction of accessible housing and not just underproduction of affordable housing. Both of those should be considerations.
Thank you, Matt. A lot of items to consider there. I want to acknowledge that there's a larger team working on the full rule. So we'll make sure that the team members, especially that are working on the acceleration program, hear and receive your comments specific to that. Really appreciate that. Wondering if there's anything else anyone would like to chime in. Sorry, and recognizing all of your comments, but wonder if there's other. Oh yeah, Garland, thank you. Go ahead.
I just want to follow up on Matt's comments about the building codes. We know that City of Portland's adopted local modifications to the state building code. So obviously that's a thing that can happen. But Dan Parolek of Opticos Design, who designed the cul-de-sac development in Tempe, Arizona, which is billed as the nation's first car-free development, has come out and said that development would not be legal to build by right in any jurisdiction in the United States. And I think that this is a challenge that those of us should take up, is to understand what Dan is talking about. What are all of the barriers that would prevent something like cul-de-sac from being constructed in any jurisdiction in Oregon? Once you start going down that rabbit hole, my prediction is that what you will discover is that it's not just the zoning code. It's the building code and it's the fire code, at the very least, that all represent barriers to such a development. And a local jurisdiction, if it wanted to legalize such a development, would need to understand and exercise its authority to rewrite all three codes: zoning, building, and fire, to allow such development by right. And I think we should be seeking to allow such developments by right. We should not be making the development that we want to see jump through more hoops than the sorts of development that we know are harming our communities and therefore we don't want to see more of.
Thanks, Garland. Good call to action for you all to get cracking on once we get through this rulemaking. So with that, we are at time, but appreciate those perspectives also about some of the other barriers that are out there that will need to be tackled as well for cities to get housing choice, equitable housing, and affordable housing actually on the ground at the level we need. I would like to just take another couple of minutes here to talk about sort of our discussion today and talk about the racial equity framework elements, which is all of them, but we hit on some of them pretty specifically around equitable engagement. We talked just a bit about benefits and burdens and how the rule might sort of work to balance that effort. Other thoughts on the racial equity framework, our discussion items today, some elements you were hoping we would have covered but didn't. Is everyone ready for lunch like me?
I'm ready for my next Zoom meeting, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, Kyle.
I think, can I get out and run for 5 minutes?
Yes, we can absolutely do that. We will see you all here next week to talk about contextualized housing need. Before I close this out, I want to offer up to Madi or Celestina any last comments or thoughts or things that I've missed that I should have covered by now. Nope.
Just big thanks.
Yeah, I think we did it.
Well, we will cede you 4 minutes and hopefully Mary Kyle can take 4 minutes to herself before the next.
I'm probably not the only one going, right?
I'm sure. Sure. Yes. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Good to see you all. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.